Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we are based, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay their respect to their elders past and present. Hi everyone, welcome to the 18th episode of the EWB UNSW Inspire series podcast, the second episode of 2022. This is a platform where we converse with interesting people and share their learnings. My name is Rong Shuan, and I'm a third-year aerospace engineering and material science student at UNSW, and currently the partnerships director for the local chapter. Today, we're joined by our esteemed guest, Dr. Ian Cunningham, who's currently a Research Institute consultant for Sustainable Futures at UTS. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm really happy to be talking with you or sharing my story today. As Ron said, my name's Ian. A little bit hard to define what I call myself in terms of a job title, but I tend to work between the social and technical interface. So I originally trained as an engineer, but I've mainly been working in the sort of social technical interface for the last 15 or so years.
Yeah, great. And so today, the general structure is we're going to explore a bit about Ian's undergrad journey, followed by industry, and then also his time with EWB, and then into his current role. And so to start us off, our audiences are, I guess, primarily new undergrads or just finishing their high school career and still deciding what career they want to do. So I just, to start us off, what do you think makes engineering such an important role, and what attracted you to engineering?
Sure, and actually I should have mentioned, just so you know, the direction that I'm going to head with this is really my focus at the moment, and just as some context where I started, is in international development, which is, you might have heard about aid. It's really engineering that deals with fairly basic services and basic needs, often in low-income countries or people who might be excluded or disadvantaged from their access to things like water, shelter, energy, etc. Yeah, and I ended up, I guess, in this career not by accident actually, but it was still definitely not a linear journey. And I think like many engineers ended up in engineering. I was interested and good at maths and science throughout university, and I was looking at both sciences and engineering. I think the practical aspect of engineering, that you weren't just studying things, you're actually then moving that next step, which into the design areas to look at solving problems. Was really what attracted me to the discipline itself. But that saying, I really didn't know what I was getting into as well. My high school was in a small country town. The first day I was at university was my first day at campus, and so it was somewhat going in a little blind, but it was a happy stumbling into engineering, I should say. I think I found the actual study, sometimes dry, sometimes interesting, but when I look back to, I guess, the work that I've been able to do, I've been really grateful for that kind of, the engineering training, the engineering grounding that I had.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. Was there potentially, something, that struck out to you in terms of, environmental issues related to developing countries? Was there something firsthand you experienced, maybe even local in Australia, that, drew you to that?
The study, the reason I did environmental engineering, I think I've always loved nature, to be honest. And so that was why, our natural environment was important to me. This is back quite a while back. My study, started university in 1998, I guess. So that was really what first drew me to it. Again, fairly naive to what it actually involved. My study itself was really, quite water focused. So it was at University of Western Australia. Most of the environmental engineering degree there, at least, is quite water focused. A lot of fluid mechanics type subjects. So oceanographic engineering type roles. My subsequent careers did draw from that, but I think the grounding that the study gives is probably more a particular way of thinking through problems and solving problems and approaching problems and designing for problems. And I think that's probably what I rested on quite a lot. But really, it was the start of my learning journey. That kind of learning obviously continued for me when I ended up working in the sector, and I think it was really probably in my first job, actually, it was a mixture of engineering. So that was a contaminated site remediation project. So where industry had been and basically made a real mess of how they disposed of their chemicals back in the 70s and 80s, and they really polluted this site. That a really beautiful natural site in New Zealand, actually, that people wanted to live in. And a big part of my role was both, how do we address the contamination issue, but also the community around that site as well were really engaged. They wanted to see the site, healed. Basically, they wanted to see the pollution fixed, and they wanted it to be restored to its natural beauty. And so I got to work a lot with them, but also on the engineering side. And I really that was kind of had a few aha moments. I think that was one for me. Is like, actually, I'm good at this, and I really like this. I really like this kind of social technical interface where and recognizing that engineering is it's for people ultimately, the majority of it, and I really enjoyed that kind of mix between both the technical side and working with people.
Yeah.
So that was probably one of the first little things. Like, I kind of like this social technical bit. I still like the technical side. I didn't want to be all totally in the social feet first in the social side. And that was probably one, and we'll probably unpack maybe a few of my other experiences, that they've all kind of tended to dance between those two spaces, I guess.
But in terms of your undergrad experience, was there any extracurriculars that you might have got yourself involved with to I guess catalyze this engineering or passion for engineering?
Yeah, not really. I was really, when I started my degree, I think there was the student group of the Institute of Engineers had a presence at the uni. There was the engineering club, but it was very, there was no Engineers Without Borders at that point in time. That really, the organisation itself, I think, started after I graduated. And actually, the engineering club wasn't really my scene, to be honest. It was a bit misogynistic in my opinion, to be honest. And so I didn't really, I didn't really have groups or other people around me at that time that kind of nurtured that interest. That really happened to me probably more once I left university. But, I think it's a different landscape for younger engineers now. I'm working at university, and I've done quite a bit with younger engineers, mainly young people involved with Engineers Without Borders, and there's just so many opportunities, I guess, to get involved and to dip your toe in. People who are interested in social or environmental change, or that interface between engineering or engineering's role in social and environmental change, that at least either they weren't around or I didn't look hard enough to find them, I think, when I was studying, to be honest. So, in answer to your question, no, to be honest, it was really just my academic study, and probably something just inherent in me that I always have that interest myself to a degree.
Fair enough.
I'll make the comments. I think when I started with EWB and started to surround myself with people who probably like what you would get now from the student clubs, it was really valuable. It kind of helped me articulate what I cared about, seeing other people around me who cared about stuff, and they knew, had some understanding of some of the issues that I've come to work on now. It just gave me a lot of very thought-provoking and helped me kind of crystallize in myself. This, I care about this stuff, and it's complex, and I can learn from what these other people who are working on these issues are doing, and their experience as well. And so that journey for me really started after graduation. But again, I think it's kind of there more now for uni students in this day and age.
That's kind of good to hear. I mean, that there's more opportunities nowadays compared to, I guess, back when you first started off. Segueing on from your undergrad journey, you mentioned, your first experience with these services. Could you kind of describe, what work you kind of did, and more, I guess, in terms of the solutions and what you, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I had this. This is sort of, you know, when I graduated from uni, I worked for 5 years in what I call as sort of a proper engineer. It was probably more, you know, it was more focused on the end, even though, you know, I did mention it had that social aspect of the job with T services. They really were more commercially focused engineering roles. And look, they gave a really good backing for understanding what it requires to be a professional engineer. You know, how do projects unfold, how to understand risk and safety on a work site. You know, what are professional standards? You know, it's quite different, I guess, from more theoretical learning that I had in university. And it was really valuable, the work experience, and it ultimately gave me some credibility when I stepped into more Engineers Without Borders type style work. That backing in more conventional engineering, you know, I think was a really useful grounding, and yeah, to then be able to apply those sorts of skills in other, you know, other cultural contexts as well. So it was funny, you know, they are really interesting roles, and they, you know, as I was saying, I learned quite a lot. I think with both of them, I reached a point where something was missing for me, and you know, I found it a little bit hard to articulate what that was, but I realized that something wasn't quite being satisfied, and I couldn't really fake it anymore, I must say. And that's sort of when I took, you know, my career took a bit of a right-hand turn. Initially into an Engineers Without Borders project. Yeah, at that point in time, when after about 5 years of working as more of a conventional engineer.
Yeah, and you mentioned a few skills that you obtained during you know, this work experience. You know, for someone who has gotten into industry, what kind of advice do you have for undergrads looking for that type of experience in general?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think even now, I think when I think about my work, it's quite hard. I found it quite hard to articulate the role, but what was useful for me and continues to be useful for me is to kind of articulate the sorts of maybe more broader qualities of what I would like to kind of experience in a job. So, you know, the things for me is like, e.g., I want to have a positive social outcome in whatever I do. I want to have a positive social environmental outcome in what I do. I want to work with people who inspire me. I want to be in a role where I can, you know, where I can continue to learn. So those kind of more, you know, slightly less tangible. Another one for me is, yeah, I want to be able to use my skills that I've got already. You know, in my case, environmental engineering, in those sorts of applications as well. So it was less like I want to be an engineer, this type of engineer with that type of company, but more those kind of qualities were more a screen for then to me when I would look at different roles. Like, okay, how many of these boxes am I ticking, you know, or not ticking, and what are the implications of that? I think that was a really useful exercise for me. And I find it even now when I think about, you know, my career 10 years down the track, it's quite hard. The job title doesn't really help me, and sometimes the company often doesn't help me. But those sorts of qualities, I think, I find them quite useful as a useful guide, I guess. So, yeah, for people who are looking, I think maybe articulate, what you want, and don't be afraid to ask it. I think my experience in working with younger people, showing you're proactive and you've reflected and thought about those kind of things, are generally looked on really favourably by companies. And you know, particularly when you're straight out of university too, I think you're probably at a good point where most things are pretty exciting because you've come out of probably what's mainly been a theoretical-based education. You're moving into getting a salary and working with teams and working on, you know, sometimes big and exciting projects too. So, you know, you might have a little bit less discretion initially, but it's just a really fabulous opportunity to learn and soak in but also, I guess, keeping in context about those broader qualities that you might want to find, and e.g., having a social and environmental impact. And I think more and more companies are kind of trying to think about those other things and seeing themselves more. A lot of the engineering companies I see these days, when they're pitching their grad recruitment, they are trying to talk to those kind of people who are interested in having a social, having an impact, having a positive impact on the world. And so I'd say don't be shy about celebrating that and asking for it. It's also, of course, really useful just to talk to other people who are working for those sorts of organisations to hear about their experience and their journey and kind of picture, do I want to be doing what they're doing, or if I saw myself in 5 years, would I be happy doing what they're doing, and use that as a bit of a reflection point as well. I think when you work for there's lots of things to consider, and the sorts of scale of the organisation you might want to work for as well. So, for example, for me, big organisations can be quite exciting, big budgets, big projects. But I like to the personal side of work environments is really important to me. So for me, I quite like smaller, more agile organisations, and so just thinking sort of through those sorts of things, and recognising as well for young engineers, you might start finding these things out after a bit of trial and error. After being in a role for a while and realising, actually, I really love X, Y, Z about this company, but this thing, it's a little bit more grating, etc., etc. So
yeah, that's definitely, I think, very valuable advice. And just to kind of recap, I think from what I understand is, I guess to start off, really figuring out and identifying what you want to get out, what you want to do for your career, in terms of social, positive environmental impact, and seeing what companies align to you. But also, talking to various industry people who have worked in there and seeing if that aligns with your values and interests. Following on, speaking about the trial and error aspect, what was something that you did after these services, and was there other opportunities that you trialed?
So I ended up after TISA, I worked for a water research laboratory as well. And again, it was similar to TISA. It gave me a different technical experience, and actually one that was very valuable, and probably a lot of my subsequent work has been around water supply and sanitation for low-income countries, so very basic water supply or access to toilets, etc. And part of the reason I think I was able to move into that sector is because my second role did focus more on water-related engineering, so looking at groundwater and water quality, etc., etc. And so that again sort of gave me a good technical background and some legitimacy that I've opened doors, I guess, for me into the development sector, in the sector they call it WASH, water, sanitation and hygiene. And when they talk about that, it's usually in the low income context. So that role again gave me a really good technical background. But similar to TISA, kind of like something's quite not working for me here. And it was after that role when I started to articulate some of those things that I shared with you before. It's like, okay, I want to use my skills for positive social impact. I was interested in traveling. Anyway, I was also in a bit of an exploration phase and going to talks and listening to other people share their stories, and somehow stumbled across an Engineers Without Borders talk when they're talking about a water supply project in Indonesia. And basically the project ticked all the boxes that I was looking for. It was very serendipitous. I'd never really even heard of Engineers Without Borders. They were quite new at that stage. And they spoke about the role. So we're looking for someone to manage this project on the ground in Indonesia. And it was the role was working with essentially like a volunteer group within a community of 4,000 people who really wanted to improve their water supply but didn't quite know how. The Australian EWB people were talking about this project, and the light bulb kind of went off. It's like, wow, this is exactly what I was looking for.
Oh, I guess the opportunity you took with EWB, working with low-income countries, it's it seems like quite a unique experience, or something not everyone would get a chance to, just in general, go overseas and work with those types of communities. What were some, I guess, well, to keep it broad, what were some interesting things that you found or learned?
Yeah, I think I was probably lucky that I'd probably say got a little bit of emotional intelligence and was generally good at working with people. And so those skills really carried me into that particular role. But also, I didn't have the grace of, for example, having exposure to Engineers Without Borders or that kind of social technical interface that much, really, either in my education or in my previous two jobs. And so I was somewhat learning on the fly, I guess, in that particular role. But it was amazing. It was, just to paint the picture. The village that I was working in, for example, they had a government project, I think probably 20 or 30 years ago, who supplied water to them, and they were just not included in the process whatsoever. And so the engineering solution that was delivered to them at the time just really didn't meet their needs, and they had no idea how to maintain the system. It wasn't designed well. It didn't really consider the social context, et cetera, and the really powerful thing about that project is that aspiration that they had. They said, we want to be involved in this project right from the beginning. They're really adamant that it was their project, and I was really, blessed in a way that the Engineers Without Borders people who were managing it had really taken that on board. They're like, this is their project. We're there to support their aspirations and not to lead, to just support their vision. And so my role, it was really fun because it wasn't just pure design. It was really the water supply is situated within their culture. It was in a Hindu culture where water was very important for the ceremony as well as day-to-day living. Cooking, cleaning, bathing, etc. Harvest, rice harvest, etc. And so having an understanding of that sort of cultural context was as more important than actually the technical context, like how much water they need, where's that going to come from? Clearly that stuff was important too, but really that knowledge needed to be, you needed to have that knowledge before you could do good design. And so, yeah, I got to explore that side of the culture with people, and that, that was so welcoming. And so just spending a lot of time walking and talking through a beautiful part of the world and learning about the culture and the people in that particular village, and that it would be easy to write that off as just fun, but it was actually really important context to then work out, okay, how would a water supply fit within this situation of what village life is like and how things are managed already and where they wanted to go. So that was a really formative project, and I was really lucky that I just struck gold. It was a fantastic place to work in that they were really clear what they wanted. Sometimes my experience is that's not the case. They were also really clear that they had ownership over the project. I had a really fantastic management team who were really backing them for it, and I was also really supported. So I had people to call on when I didn't know what to do as well. So certainly, you often think you need to know everything, but you don't. And so there was some of the technical stuff too, where it was over my pay grade, so to speak. So I just had other people who I could draw on to help me. And so it was really walking through that process, and it was a very slow burn project, and that was part of it too. If the actual technical solution in that case was very simple. If you came in as an engineer, you could probably have a design and have people, have water coming out of the tap in a month, and I was there for 18 months, and the project itself went on for probably 3 or 4 years. And the fact that it went at the pace of the people in the community was one of the reasons why it was so successful.
Another potential segue we could go into is, you mentioned how the systems and the solutions that they already had in place before weren't I guess, working as efficiently or had some issues. And I also noticed that for your PhD, you did something related to this. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah.
Was that something that inspired you to further research?
Actually, it's a good, well picked up. Yeah, exactly. That kind of project originally was probably the after that role, I went on to work with Engineers Without Borders for another five or 6 years, I think, and subsequently ended up doing a PhD a little bit after that. And yeah, exactly, it was totally inspired by that experience. And that experience for me, that project was very hyper local. Was working in the village with 4,000 people, whereas the institute that I did my research on more look at kind of the whole system. How did not just that one village, but how does the whole governance of water and management of water happen at a much broader level? Kind of support more equal access to water and sanitation. And my I guess the project I ended up working on for my research was looking at slight digression, but in most low-income countries all around the world, you have a situation like I was working with the community in Indonesia, where you have a group of volunteers. The government sort of says, okay, that with all this rural population who have poor access to water, we don't have the money or the resources to go out and build all these systems and manage them. So what we're going to do is we're going to have volunteer community people manage water within their community. So you can imagine if you were living in that place, you might be collecting money for your neighbours, doing repairs, keeping the site clean, troubleshooting, doing maintenance as it comes up. And that model has delivered water to millions and millions of people around the world, actually. But it's also had a lot of problems as well, because it has meant in some places the government's washed their hands of their responsibility, or they've left people on their own without providing them ongoing support or ongoing training, or finance if something really serious goes wrong. So I was looking at, it's quite a niche area. I was looking at the motivations of those people who volunteer, and so what actually drives them to want to manage water, to do those repairs, to go to their neighbours and say, sorry, it's time for you to pay. Even when money might be scarce, it's time for you to pay your monthly fee. And how do program designers actually either support or mess up those motivations when you come in to design a water project. And so it might sound a bit like psychology, and it was a mixture of both engineering. So, okay, what are people doing to keep these systems running? International development, so looking at this in a low-income country context, and psychology, like what are people's individual motivations to actually do this work, because they're important. Like the people maintaining the system were one piece of the system that kept the water running, but they're an important piece, because really they were at the bleeding edge, so to speak. If the water supply broke down, like in one of the villages I was interviewing people, for example, before there was a water supply, in the dry season, the women would walk as much as 4 or 5 hours to get one bucket of water, and they'd leave 1 or 2 in the morning, leaving in a group to kind of ensure some level of safety. And so if those things if they're not operating, it matters. It matters a lot. So yeah, I was looking at their motivations. It was really fun. It was a bit of an accident. I fell into the PhD, I must say. You might have gathered from some of my answers, I like working with people. I like the collaborative process, and a PhD can be quite solitary and isolating at times. That's saying, there was a fieldwork component, but surprisingly found it really, really interesting and really insightful. And I think ultimately, hopefully, mean I'm more effective at what I do as well. So, yeah.
And so just to clarify, did you look at various volunteer groups at different locations, or?
Yeah. So there was six villages I went to. So the country my research ended up being in, which was slightly by accident, was in Malawi, which is southeastern Africa, and So yeah, there were 6 kind of villages that I was interviewing those people who were responsible for managing water to understand what their motivations were. And the motivations thing is really interesting because it's really universal. What drives us as humans and is like it was an interesting experience for me because going through a PhD, because I'd be reflecting on my own motivations. Why am I doing this PhD? When do I have, when am I in a state of flow, for example, with my PhD, and when I'm like, oh, I'm just really over this. And it's a very universal principle. And I was sort of looking at that with the people who are managing water too. What was it that made them go the extra mile with their management, and what was it that meant they're like, actually, I'm over this, I've had enough and I'm checking out, or do half a job instead of the full job, that kind of thing. So, and I think even though my context was in Malawi, a lot of that learnings is how do you design with people or for people, and how do you consider the kind of, with engineering, everything can often be quite black and white with design, but when you involve people, that you have different attitudes and values and histories and education, and things just get a lot more grey, and I think in my mind a lot more interesting as well. And that's the same for anywhere in Australia as it is for Malawi, actually. And I think that's just really interesting to me, actually, as well. How do you design in those, with that kind of greyness, with that human complexity, when you bring that into your projects?
Yeah. And then moving on from your PhD, was this, so you continued in this, I guess, role, like Institute Sustainable Futures, and was that right? And then so you've now become a senior research consultant.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and could you, I don't know, describe some of the work that you do now, and
sure.
what you hope to achieve?
Yeah. So I mean, I think I'm doing a little bit of independent consulting work and some work with UTS as well. So just for example, one of the independent roles I had recently was looking at greater Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander engagement in engineering for student engineers. So, what is it that could or does drive Aboriginal people to think about engineering as a career? So it's sort of trying to break that down, and research is often, less about hard design, but sort of asking kind of juicy questions to work out what are some of the causal factors that support or promote social change. That was one project. Another, really fun one I'm working at the moment at UTS is with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They had this competition, I think it was 10 or 12 years ago, called the Reinvented Toilet Competition. And basically people were inventing these toilets from the future, and we're probably not going to see them in people's homes for maybe another 15 years, but they're really fancy, basically. Some of them, for example, they'll separate, they'll filter the wee and then be reusing that in the flushing system, and they'll take the feces, the poo, and then dry that and burn it and use that to run a generator within the system. Like, they're crazy. They're really amazing technology. There's some great YouTube videos if you're interested in that kind of stuff. So, and I'm, along with my colleagues, we're looking at, okay, so what about, how do these toilets stack up in a climate change scenario? So a lot of them are off grid. They're recycled. They're a closed loop system. They require either no or very little water input, or no or very little energy input. So in theory, they should be good for things like floods, but we're trying to actually dive in a little bit deeper. And so the designers, when they're designing, say, okay, so if we wanted this to last in a context of climate change, flood, drought, changing temperatures, all these different scenarios which could impact the actual structure, could impact the way treatment happens, what would need to happen, or how do we even start to assess that? So that one's really fun. There's lots of universities who've come up with these toilets, and we're working with them and the foundation to do that assessment. I'll just talk about one more project too. Is actually this one's coming up, so I haven't actually started this one. Is looking at the Sustainable Development Goals. So for those of you who don't know, they're
SDGs.
SDGs, exactly. They're kind of a globally agreed group of goals that deal with things like, sustainability issues, so gender equality, water and sanitation, access to education, etc. And with a colleague, we're looking at how much money is needed in the Pacific. So think of islands like Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Fiji, etc. How much money is needed to meet the SDGs around water and sanitation? So what would a government need to spend in each of those countries if we actually want to hit access for all for water and sanitation? And the kind of things research is interesting for me. It's like I would have thought someone knew the answers to those already, but they don't. And research is really important to start to ask those questions and understand those questions, and then from that, people come up with strategies like, okay, we need X $100 million over the next 10 years to deliver, in that case, water and sanitation. How's that going to happen? Who's going to do that? And how do we prioritize that kind of thing? So I think that's what the PhD really taught me is, how to ask useful questions, and then how to actually design your research to answer that in a way that stands up to criticism or to people who then use that information to build designs based on your research.
Yeah. That's great to hear. Unfortunately, we're kind of nearing towards the end of the podcast, and I just wanted to throw one more, one more question at you, and it's something related to what you brought up, like the SDGs. Do you think, Australia, in terms of Australia, and like us as a community, do you think we're contributing enough towards the SDGs, or what kind of progress? How would you comment on the progress that Australia is making on the SDGs?
It's a good question, and I probably can't dive into the weeds of detail enough. But I mean, I'll just maybe make one comment that really stood out for me. And someone once described it as, it's not just raising the floor, so it's not just supporting low-income countries, it's also lowering the ceiling. So recognising that in countries like Australia, we are just so lucky, and we actually live really, really comfortable lives, but have also a lot of that comfort and wealth has come on the back of burning fossil fuels and environmental exploitation and colonisation to a degree as well. And so that the SDGs really don't require not just raising the floor, but also lowering the ceiling. That it's also about a redistribution of wealth and power. And I think that's something that the SDGs were really different from the Millennium Development Goals. Are more focused on, okay, what can we do to raise the floor to kind of help more low-income countries, whereas SDGs is also not just about, yes, we need to do that. We also need to reflect in Australia how we're achieving the SDGs, but also, how we can be part of that redistributing wealth and power both domestically and globally as well. So of course, there's always more to do too. But that's just, I think, something that I often consider when I'm talking to people about the SDGs as well.
Yeah, for sure. That's interesting take on the question. And I guess that kind of brings us to the end of today's podcast or episode. And just to recap, we explored a bit about Ian's undergrad journey, why and how he got into engineering in the first place. Some advice here as well. He offered some advice on how to navigate your way into industry, and we also spoke about we discussed a bit about his different projects, and towards the end we talked about his PhD and his current work as a research consultant. I just want to thank Ian again for his time, being able to make it today and joining us today. And for our audiences, if you have any questions for Ian, feel free to forward us the questions, and we'll be happy to pass it to Ian after the episode. And in terms of the next episode, our next guest is Eleanor Earle. if you do have any questions for Eleanor, feel free to submit the questions via our Google form, and we'll see if we can integrate that into the next episode. Did you have any final words did you want to say, Ian?
No, just thanks for creating the space for me to share my story as well. And yeah, as Ron said, any questions, just send them through EWB UNSW, and happy to keep discussing in another forum.